Hello and welcome to the Meet the Parents podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 51 of the Meet the Parents podcast and your weekly slice of parenting-based chat. I'm Tim, and this week I'm chatting with Amie. So, good evening. How are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad, thanks. So, if it sounds like we're winging it a little bit tonight, that's because we are. We were going to be joined by Hannah this evening, but sick children, you know how it is, means that we've had to change our plans. So tonight, Amie and I are going to have a chat about holidays, in particular the pros and cons of taking them during term time. Now, we've only just had the Easter school break, but you just know that the summer holidays will be upon us before we know it, with many families going away and facing big crowds and even bigger price hikes for the privilege of going away during late July and August. Now, Amie, with Little Miss, you've got this summer and next summer, I guess, to enjoy not having to worry about being constrained by term times before she heads off to school. So while you don't have a school-age child yet, or even thinking back to the time before Little Miss came along.
What happy, peaceful times they were.
I know. I'm struggling to remember what they were like. So when do you choose to go on holiday? Do you tend to go during cheaper, quieter periods when the rest of us have our kids still in school?
Yeah, we basically completely avoid any school holiday periods. Before we had our daughter and now, there have actually been full-blown rows between my partner and I, because his little brother and sister are only 12 and 10 now. But obviously over the last few years, they've definitely had school time holidays, and so if we ever wanted to go on holiday with his family, they go during term times. My mum is also a teacher, so if we ever want to go on holiday with her, it has to be in school holiday times as well. And there's just been rows because I basically refused to go skiing in February half term, which means we can't go with his family and things. But as far as I was concerned, while we could go in a cheaper time, why would we not? So yeah, we definitely avoid the holidays.
Yeah, so when do you typically tend to go for your summer holiday?
End of June, first week of July at a push, which is actually what we're doing this year. But pretty much from early to mid-July it starts to hike up in price. So yeah, we're usually end of June, and then we'll often go away maybe for a week in September as well and kind of top and tail it.
Yeah, that's very similar to what we used to do pre-kids. Have you got any particular holiday plans for the rest of this year?
Well, it's funny you should say, because I think our plans have just been blown out the water. So as you mentioned, it's our last kind of free year. And from September, our daughter is leaving. She's in a private nursery at the moment because we both work full time. And from September, she's going to join the nursery school at the infant school in our town. And we thought that meant that we basically were getting the 33 hours free, and we were sort of doing a dance on the table because we were going to have loads of spare money from September. And so we basically had said, do you know what, we're going to be really naughty, and instead of putting that money towards the house we're trying to buy, we're just going to go on our first proper blowout holiday. We were going to go for 2 weeks in October, November time, September, and we're probably going to go to Japan. Which is somewhere we've really wanted to go for ages. We were going to take our daughter, and now we've discovered that actually we only get 15 free hours because nowhere's offering the 30 free hours, which means that actually we can't really afford to go to Japan for 2 weeks,
no.
all three of us. So yeah, we're still kind of figuring out what we're going to do instead that's more within our price range now. Probably just the south of France in June, which will be equally lovely, just not quite what we've been expecting. So it feels a little bit like sour cherries at the moment, which is a shame, but never mind.
That is a shame because those summers before they get bound by school terms are such valuable commodities. I mean, we've been bound by school terms for a few years now. I guess Isaac's year 4, so this is the 5th year in which we've had at least one child in school. And, as we've said in the past, we used to take advantage of going on a holiday or on day trips at random times. So, summer holidays in June and in mid-September, or day trips to places like Legoland on random weekdays, which is so much less stressful than trying to go on a weekend or during the school holidays.
It's just so much more pleasant as well. I mean, you don't have to deal with other people's children.
Yeah, and you don't have to queue for an hour to get on rides and all that stuff. It's such a much more enjoyable experience, which obviously once your kids are in school, unless you're going to take them out of school for a day, isn't an opportunity that's open to you. But since Isaac moved up to school, we've had to fall in line with everyone else. So this year we've just come back from a few days in Weymouth the week after Easter. We're driving around Europe for 2 weeks in August, and then we'll do our traditional October half-term long weekend at Butlins. Now, as we've discovered the hard way, going away during school holidays is an expensive business. With so many families wanting to get away during a narrow window, simple laws of supply and demand mean that hotels, flights, etc. cost an awful lot more in holiday weeks than they do outside them. Now, I recently saw some stats that were pulled together by travel services company FareFX that revealed just how much holiday companies jack up their prices out of term time. For instance, the cost of a 7-night stay on a 4 or 5-star all-inclusive package in Lanzarote is 33% more in August than it is in June. And that's actually a relatively small price differential. So for an equivalent holiday in Rhodes, it's an eye-watering 77% more expensive in August versus June. So if you booked a family holiday that cost, let's say, £1,500 in June, the same package in August would cost an extra £1,155, which is a lot of ouzo and moussaka. And while I don't have equivalent figures for UK-based holidays, it's safe to assume that the price increases are of a similar order of magnitude. So, Amy, what's your immediate reaction to that? Surprise, disgust, resignation?
I probably can't verbalise what was going through my mind. It is a family show. But I'm torn because of the marketing brain in me is going, well, yeah, of course you're going to jack up the prices. It's supply and demand, like you said. But the parent in me, and obviously my mum being a teacher, I've heard it from her for many, many years, even since I left school. It's not fair because nobody else has to pay extra for their holiday just because they work a specific shift pattern, which is what teachers and anyone who works in a school has to contend with. As parents, it really sucks, but I suppose you have children, you know that's coming in a way. But yeah, it does grate. I can't deny that.
Yeah, and it's quite a stark difference in prices, isn't it? I mean,
it's shocking.
Yeah, I mean, when you hear those numbers about how much more expensive travel is during the school holidays, it's no surprise that it's tempting for parents to take their kids out during term time instead of waiting for the holidays. And, for some people, it's easy to imagine that that's the only way that a holiday is in any way affordable.
Especially if they're kind of infants and early primary school. I think once you get into senior school, it is potentially a bit irresponsible, but especially in primary and infants, you just sort of think, for goodness sake, do some counting with them. Make sure you kind of ask them to spell a couple of things while you're there, and what they're getting in return is probably as equal a learning experience, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point, and let's definitely come back to that, because as you're alluding to that, there isn't that kind of flexibility. It's not necessarily black and white. There are learning opportunities when you take kids away on holiday, but schools don't really seem to have that latitude anymore. In fact, in 2013, there was an adjustment to the national policy for UK schools, whereby parents who take their children out of school during term time without their head teacher's permission can be fined for doing so. Now, the guidelines are are freely available on the government website gov.uk, and I'll put a link in the show notes. And I mean, just to summarise them, they state the following. You can only allow your child to miss school if they are ill, or if you have received advanced permission from the school's head teacher. If you go down the latter route, that means you have to make an application to the head teacher in advance. And in the past, head teachers did have a little bit of discretion. They could grant 10 days of authorised absence for special circumstances. But since 2013, they're unable to grant any except in what's now called exceptional circumstances. What happens if you take your child out of school without permission? You could be fined £60, which rises to £120 if you don't pay within 21 days. And, to top it all off, if you don't pay up within 28 days, you can, in theory, be prosecuted and fined up to £2,500 or receive a jail sentence of 3 months. In effect, a parental decision to take children on holiday is essentially criminalised.
Jesus, I'm not laughing anymore, am I? Bloody hell.
It's almost an obvious question, isn't it, to ask why such apparently extreme measures need to be taken. So I guess to look at both sides of the fence, let's put the situation into a wider context. So if you look at the numbers, you can see why the government might have wanted to take action. So absences from schools have been rising for a number of years. And in the most recent complete academic year, so 2015 to 16, 12% of school pupils missed at least half a day due to unauthorised family holidays, while a further 3% were absent due to agreed family breaks. Now that's more than one child in 7 missing some time during the year for holidays alone, and it certainly surprised me that the percentages were that high. Over the past couple of years, there's been a particularly high-profile case in the UK involving a father on the Isle of Wight who took his 6-year-old daughter on a week's holiday to Florida. He was slapped with a fine, but he refused to pay. He initially won verdicts in both the Magistrates and High Court, but last month the Supreme Court ruled against him. He now has to pay legal costs of £10,000 and he will face fines of up to £1,000, which, ouch.
The holiday probably doesn't seem as good value anymore, does it?
Yeah, it certainly doesn't seem like such a great idea, does it? And, I don't know if you saw any of it, but on social media at least, the Supreme Court decision was mostly met with a combination of horror and anger from parents muttering about state control. What do you think about that, Amy?
I can see both sides. I think as a parent who would not abuse the system, I feel really up in arms about it, because I just think, for goodness sake, if my child misses half of a day once during the year, just so that we can pay a flight back for like a Monday morning or to leave on the Friday afternoon, so that we're not paying literally like 33% more or whatever it was that you cited before, that's fine. But equally, I can see that you can't have one rule for parents that won't abuse the system and one rule for parents that you do, because that's discriminatory. And also, where do you draw the line? What is considered abusing the system and what isn't? And it's just easier, as with all walks of life, to just draw a line in the sand, but that isn't crossable, if you know what I mean. And so I can see both sides of and you're only as, from the government's perspective, I can see that they have to accommodate for the parents who will abuse the system, because they're the ones that really you've got to account for with these types of rules and regulations. So it's a really difficult one. I mean, they're damned if they do, damned if they don't, because they have to do what they think is right for the children's education as well.
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's, you have to have a rule that's consistent for all manner of parents and situations, because I do think that in principle it would be great to afford schools some discretion, but at the same time, as you've kind of alluded to, the reality is that if you don't have rigid rules and you create that space for grey areas, then you end up with two problems. I think firstly, you run the risk of different schools interpreting the rules in different ways, so you don't get any consistency. And then, secondly, such as human nature, that parents will find ways to exploit any loopholes that do exist, which actually is exactly what happened in the case that we're talking about here, where the parents interpreted the rules as being that having a good attendance record, I think the girls' attendance record was something like 92, 93%. They thought that represented a good enough justification for taking their daughter out of school without permission. I think in some ways I'm probably in a small minority. I do have some reservations about how black and white the judgment is, but at the same time I think I'm broadly in agreement with the principle of at least encouraging parents to stick to set term dates and keep holidays for holiday time. You can argue it both ways, but there is, apparently a fair body of evidence that shows that taking kids out of school can potentially be damaging to their education and disruptive to their classmates. Although
that's one of the things that crossed my mind, was it's not just about the individual child. If you have planned a lesson, you can tell I'm a teacher's daughter, if you've planned a lesson where the kids need to be in pairs and you've got an even number in the class, but if somebody's ill, they're ill, but if you then have 3 kids who suddenly are taking a half a day to take a flight, your lesson plan is out the window. You don't have enough kids for your activity. That affects the kids who are playing by the rules and being in school when they're supposed to be, and their lesson then is affected because they can't complete the activity properly because you don't have enough kids for the teams or whatever it might be, and that's not fair either.
Yeah, no, that's right, and and that's an argument that you often hear from parents who are opposed to any kind of control over their ability to take their kids out of school. Will it really make a difference to the rest of the class if I take my child out of school a week or two before the end of the summer term, as they're often winding down then anyway at the end of term. And when you look at it in isolation, it does, that argument does make a certain degree of sense, doesn't it? But
it does.
Not much happens at certain times in the school year, and the loss of educational benefit is arguably relatively small at those times. But then, I look at it and think, is that just the thin end of the wedge? 1 or 2 children being absent in a class of, let's say, 30 the week before the summer holidays arguably has little impact. But what happens if it's 8 or 9 who are suddenly absent at the same time in mid to late June, which is when we know holiday prices are at their cheapest before the summer price rises really start to kick in? And as you've said as well, it's also worth remembering that many teachers are parents as well, like your mother is. It's not that they could or would in reality, but what if they all decided that they were going to follow suit with all the other parents and take a week's holiday during term time? It's not as if most teachers are rolling in disposable income and can afford to pay that August premium.
Absolutely.
And it's really difficult when you start to look at some of the detail and the complexity.
I think as well, the last thing I would say as well is, what are you teaching children if you take them out of school? And that's me being super kind of devil's advocate-y, because as I've said at the start, what is a half day, 1 half day in the entire school year? But I think back to, it's the equivalent of when I was in like year 6, year 7, I had to do exams twice a year, and they were just internal. They didn't mean anything apart from probably helping decide which set you were in for the rest of the school year. But what I learned in terms of revision and technique for revision, and learn the hard way in year 7 what it meant not to revise for an exam, stood me hugely beneficial once I was already at GCSE when it did matter. And I think there is something to be said for, if you kind of place that seed in a primary school student's mind of what's a half day here, what's a half day there. With some children, they'll then reach senior school where it does really matter that they don't miss those half days here and there. And actually they're still in that mindset, and then actually that will really affect them. So there is something to be said for setting the right example as well.
Yeah, that's right. I guess a line has to be drawn somewhere, doesn't it? And let's come back to an argument that you were talking about or referencing a little bit earlier. If you do take a child out of school for a holiday, it does cost them some formal education time, but you can also argue that it can also open up a child to different learning experiences beyond what they would learn in the classroom. okay, learning opportunities are perhaps a little bit less obvious at Disney World than they might be at, I don't know, taking a child to witness Chinese New Year in Asia, or, you know, taking them to the battlefields of Western Europe, say. But what would you think if schools permitted children time away on the condition that they complete some kind of assignment, you know, whether it's keeping a holiday diary or writing about their observations about different national cultures and religious festivals or so on? Do you think there's still some value in that, potentially?
I think the question of where you draw the line is too hazy again, because I completely agree. Like the battlefield trip, it's funny you should mention that, because I actually thought of that one. And I remember doing GCSE history, and that was a school trip that we all went on as part of GCSE history. And then equally, my mum and I went on a city break to Berlin when I was doing my GCSE history, and we were doing World War II and stuff. And I got to visit things that they literally brought my GCSE to life, and as a result I have no doubt I was far more passionate about that GCSE because I had tangible things to link it to. But then when you're in primary school, it doesn't need to be as educational, because you're still probably going to be learning about another culture, and that's just as important. You might be exposed to another language, and even if you're not going to go on and learn about that, you're trying different foods, but not everyone will do that with their children on holiday.
It also occurs to me that if you did go down the route of, you know, maybe setting a child an assignment or an essay or a project to do to help consolidate their learning from the holiday, what do you do if the child then comes back and doesn't complete the assignment? You can't really punish them for that. It's really difficult, and the lines do get blurry very quickly, don't they? So,
and with regards to the extra work, from a teacher's perspective, not only are you not there during the lesson, but then that's something extra for them to have to mark and grade that they didn't set. It's nothing to do with their lesson plan. Teachers already work hundreds of extra hours per term that they're not paid for, and yet they have extra work to mark, and that doesn't seem fair on the teachers.
Let's switch the focus from schools now to the travel companies. Now, one of the most common arguments you hear is that the government should legislate against holiday companies charging so much during the school holidays. So what do you think to that? Is it a good idea? Is it a workable idea?
I think it's a good idea to a point, but I don't know how workable it is, because as you said at the beginning, it's a case of supply and demand. And when strawberries aren't in season, they are a higher price because we have to import them, as opposed to being able to pick British strawberries that you don't then pay import tax on. So it's exactly the same, really. When holidays are in high demand, there's less space on flights, or they have to pay to put extra flights on. So yeah, there is going to be an increase in price, but I don't know if it justifies quite as much as they charge extra, really.
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? I mean, I do understand where the basis for this idea comes from, and in principle, it's all well and good. It would be great, but I think in reality it's pretty much unworkable. You know, as we've said, it's driven as much by supply and demand as anything else. And actually, it is a competitive market. You know, while there is a certain degree of profiteering by holiday companies during peak holiday periods, they are at the same time competing against one another. So you can only push the prices so high before you become uncompetitive versus other travel companies. So there is a degree of control in terms of pricing there, even though it doesn't feel like it based on the numbers we were talking about earlier. And to even attempt to legislate against free market economics on a local level is something that's fraught with danger. Travel's a global business. You can't stop people buying holidays from a company anywhere in the world who aren't subject to UK laws. So, you know, to legislate against UK travel companies, say, would be, you would end up putting them at a disadvantage. And, it's not as if the demand ever goes away. It would just shift to different times of year. And I suspect all that would happen is that the holiday operators would put up prices at off-peak times of year to make up for what they lose in school holidays, and to reflect increased demand at those times. So ultimately, I think everyone would suffer. It's a zero-sum game. For every place the consumer wins, there's somewhere else where people will lose out. And as we've said a couple of times, if you're a parent who happens to be a teacher, you lose out no matter what.
I have to say it is bonkers though, in terms of, so for example, we ski, and obviously there is a limited and finite amount of time in the year that we can go skiing because of conditions and weather. And that means that the one holiday you have in in school holiday time, that is a good chance of snow is February half term, because New Year is often a bit hit and miss, as we experienced this year when we had 0 snow. And Easter, obviously, because it changes every year, if it happens too close to April, you end up skiing through slush if there's snow at all. My partner's parents actually rang us this weekend and said, have you given any thought to when you want to go skiing next season? And we were like, no, it's April. What are you talking about? And they have a chalet in the Alps, and so they were looking at when they want to go. And there is already, on most of the airlines, it's flagging that there's barely any seats left on flights for February half term. And that's when it really starts to irritate me, because it's not just about it being high in price. It's not just about the premium. It's the fact that you end up having to book holidays literally a year in advance. And it's just like, I can't think that far ahead. I'm not that organized. And it just is bonkers.
And that's definitely something you learn to get used to as a parent of a school-age child. Long gone are the days when you'd be on lastminute.com booking something for that weekend. Nowadays, it's absolutely not uncommon to book a year in advance, or to book your next year's holiday just as you're completing the current year's one.
It's insane. And then this year we're looking at south of France end of June, and we haven't even booked our flights yet, and it's looking like 55 quid return. And it just feels like this is a whole new world to us. We're not quite ready to join you in the school time holidays yet.
I guess one final thing. I mean, here's the thing. That no great surprise. Anyone who knows me knows that I'm a numbers person. So let's look at some numbers now. Like most parents, I do have my kids' best interests at heart. So I would think really hard before applying to take them out of school for a holiday. But let's say I wasn't that conscientious a parent. Let's do the maths. So I talked earlier about an example where a holiday that costs £1,500 in June could cost an extra, 1,100 odd in August. Now, weigh that up against paying a £60 fine. Now, even if that's a £60 fine for each of our 3 kids, and when you look at it like that, are still a hell of a lot cheaper in June than August. Yes, the fine is a disincentive, and that's really the point of it, but if you are determined to take your kids on a cheap holiday, the fine isn't prohibitive compared to the cost of paying full whack in August. Now, I'm sure that there are many parents who do exactly that calculation and just decide to bite the bullet and pay the fine, knowing that their holiday is still considerably cheaper than it would be if they waited until August with everyone else. Now, whether you should do that or not, that's entirely a choice for parents. But as we've discussed, there are financial benefits to taking your kids out during term time. But it's a more complex issue than that in terms of the impact it potentially has, not just on your own child, but on other people's children as well, and on the lesson plans that teachers put together. So anyhow, I'm now off to take out a second mortgage so that we can afford to go away in August and not have to spend 2 weeks sleeping in our own car to save money. Failing that, we'll be holidaying in a tent in our back garden. So before we go, what have you been up to, Amy, during and since Easter?
We've been making a conscious effort to be a bit more chilled. We just had too many weekends booked up on the trot after Christmas, so we had a quiet weekend over Easter, and actually this weekend we had a child-free weekend, which was quite a treat. We ended up down a black hole of Netflix for most of Saturday, but it was really nice. I should feel more rested than I do, I think.
And of course we've been the complete opposite, so we had a pretty busy Easter holiday. Cara went to spend a few days staying with her grandparents in London at the start of the holiday, which left our house feeling very weird in her absence.
Aww.
We took the kids to one of those Go Ape type places on Good Friday, so lots of clambering around with ropes and harnesses and swings and slides in the trees.
I always think they look awesome.
Typically, Cara took to it like a duck to water. And as I mentioned earlier, we slipped down to Weymouth for a few days for a bit of the Great British Seaside Holiday, which meant amusement arcades, ice creams, a few more amusement arcades, and braving the beach where we alternated between huddling in coats and springtime sunburn. So it's time to crack open the Factor 50 again, I think.
Yeah.
And that's it for another episode of the Meet the Parents podcast. We'll be back next week, but in the meantime, here's where you can find the two of us online. Amy?
I'm on Twitter at Amie Caitlin, that's AmieCaitlin, and on Instagram at Finding Our Feet. My blog is still live, it's findingourfeet.co.uk, but it's currently on hiatus.
And I'm at Thatcham Dad, and my blog is slouchingtowardsthatcham.com. So you can download this podcast on iTunes and Android devices from our website at meettheparentspodcast.com, and also via a variety of podcasting apps. Do also give us a follow on Twitter at Parents Podcast and Facebook at facebook.com/meettheparentspodcast. Anyway, thanks for listening, and do please join us again next week. Good night.